historically, like, a lot of what Canadian identity has been is just distinguishing itself from the United States, because it's a really small country and it borders with the United States, and so we've tried to somehow be distinct, and mostly the identity has arisen from, we're different from Americans. We're not American, we're Canadian.
McGill University is one of the most diverse schools in the world. Approximately 12% of the undergraduate student body draws from the US, which is a large amount considering non-Quebecois Canadians only account for 31%. Interaction between Canadians and Americans takes place at McGill on a huge scale. It presents itself as a case study to try to understand the subtle cultural differences that define Canadian and American national identity. In this piece, TVM News speaks with professors from linguistics, history, political science, and sociology, as well as students from both sides of the border, to search for identity in a comparative perspective. Canada is still technically considered part of Great Britain, operating under the constitutional monarchy as a federal parliament. In 1867, the Constitution Act was passed, laying out Canada's federalist policies, and in 1931, the Statute of Westminster opened the British Commonwealth countries, such as Canada, to independent legislatures. This is in direct opposition to America's founding, which came from its 1776 revolution, in which 50,000 people died and an entirely new country was born. U.S. history professor Jason Opel explains that process and its long-lasting effect on American identity.
And more or less before anyone knew it, the relatively unthinkable idea of independence from the British Crown became common sense, in the words of the most famous pamphlet on the subject. A civil war ensued that was often very violent between, as well as within these provinces. And for a variety of reasons, the British were unable to keep control of those colonies, and more or less the United States stumbled upon existence and had to invent the ideology of nationhood. And the ideology of the ideological quality of American nationalism is probably the thing that is most distinctive, or one of the things distinctive about American nationalism, and probably accounts for some of the differences or cultural differences that are perceived and I think also real between Americans and Canadians. I would say that the reason that American nationalism had to be invented, or had to be, as many historians say, forged, that is created or imagined or performed in a way that being French or being Chinese or perhaps even being Quebecois didn't require in the same way, because it was an act of political violence, an act of political revolution, or at least political independence. The only consistent ideology is of opposition to overweening government. In Canada, there is more of a, there's more of an available language for the state or for public institutions to be a good thing. There is more of a sense in Canada, as in most other Western countries, that civil society requires that the general population is disarmed. And most people don't take that to mean impending threat from the government. They think of it in terms of society. In the US, there's a strong perhaps the word is anti-government, anti-society undercurrent to American thought, which would perceive such a disarmament as a threat. That is a distinct difference between Canada and the United States. It's more particular policies that kind of, set off these deeply held political beliefs.
Our next section is on speech patterns. Grad student Jeff Klassen, along with a mix of Canadians and Americans, try to make sense of the difference between sorry and sorry.
But when you look at the general dialects, there are some subtle differences between Canadian English and American English.
Oh, this is just a trap. Do you want to go out to the movies tonight? Come on. Do you have a cat or a dog? When I went fishing, I caught a cod. I will buy some milk tomorrow.
Do you want to go out to the movies tonight? Do you have a cat or dog? When I went fishing, I caught a cod. I will buy some milk tomorrow.
Do you want to go out to the movies tonight? Do you have a cat or dog? When I went fishing, I caught a cod. I will buy some milk tomorrow.
Betty Botter bought a bit of butter. I will buy some milk tomorrow. When I went fishing, I caught a cod.
So you see in a complex vowel, which is called a diphthong, like ow and A is also considered a diphthong. In certain contexts, these vowels are very different from the vowels in American speech. So this is why you get stuff like about sounding like a boot to Americans. Like, it's a really salient sort of vowel difference. I think that dialect and identity go hand in hand. And people speak differently depending on their identity all the time.
The United States and Canada have a similar racial makeup, with America's white population composing approximately 72% to Canada's 85%. Despite the United States housing more visible minorities, Canada is viewed internationally as one of the most diverse countries. We can compare this to the United States, which does have a greater percentage of minorities and is a country founded by immigrants, but earns a reputation that has been sculpted by laws regarding race, from Japanese internment to Arizona immigration law. Here, Professor Morton Weinfeld gives us a brief account of the Canadian melting pot and the American mosaic.
In the United States, you have a certain rhetoric that talks about, e pluribus unum, which is out of many one on the coins, and there is, the image of the melting pot has gained currency in popular discourse in the United States. In Canada, we want to separate ourselves, differentiate ourselves from the United States, so we look for a different metaphor. And in fact, in the B&A Act, Canada's Constitution, there is a clear kind of groupness that you find, right? There are certain rights in the B&A Act for people who speak English and people who speak French, for people who are Catholic and people who are Protestant. That kind of stuff is not found in the American Constitution. It's much more of a universalistic document. So those constitutional factors can play a role in how these two images were shaped. Then, of course, 30 or 40 years ago, Canada moved to make this more official by embracing formally or officially multiculturalism. For example, in the Canadian Constitution, we have a multicultural section. And you don't have anything like that in the American Constitution. We are multicultural in Canada. We are more tolerant. We haven't had, slavery. We didn't have the race wars. We didn't have the big riots that they had in the United States in the 60s. We're just a kinder, gentler sort of place. The American public is more concerned with immigration as a policy issue. There is this fear that the borders are out of control and that there is no process at work. There's no planning as there is, let's say, in Canada, where you have much more of an attempt to plan immigration. You have governments involved more in immigrant integration processes. So I think in the United States there is more apprehension, which is ironic because the United States is a nation of immigrants, and every American school child sort of knows that.
America's Democratic and Republican parties, as we know them, have been the major parties of the American political system for the last 80 years. While Canada lists the Conservative Party, the New Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, the Green Party, and the Bloc Québécois all as major players. In this part, we explore how the party system affects institutional progress, voter identification, and democratic strength with political science and Canadian Studies professor Antonia Maioni.
So the interesting difference between Canada and the United States in terms of their party systems is that Canada has a party system that's based on a parliamentary system of government. And so we have parties that are disciplined, we have parties that tend to be more cohesive, and parties that have quite a bit of influence when there's a majority government in power. In the United States, we have a party system that is a little different because it's a presidential system of government. And so political parties have some discipline, but in effect, individual members of the Congress are free to vote as they often feel in terms of a particular policy area. In the United States, we have a two-party system. It's a very strong bipartisan system. It's very difficult for third parties to get any kind of a foothold, whereas in Canada, we've had experience with two parties, but also three-party and even multi-party systems, both at the provincial level and at the federal level. So healthcare is a nice example and illustration of the differences in party systems between Canada and the US. Because if we look at the historical record, what we find in Canada is the presence of a third party, in this case a party of the left, a party that developed a very strong voice as a pro-reform message for healthcare insurance, for publicly funded healthcare insurance. This is the what we now know as the New Democratic Party, which was originally a party known as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. In the U.S., healthcare reform has been on presidential agenda since the beginning of the 20th century, and yet it was never able really to move in the way that it did in Canada, particularly in the sense of building a national health insurance program or publicly funded universal health care, in part because the message for that reform was captured within the two-party system. And so having a Democratic Party that had to contend with so many competing visions, this kind of a voice for a strong national public system was never able to affect public policy in the same way that it was in Canada. And I think that what you see in Canada is the ability for different points of view to have a voice. And so the feeling perhaps that citizens have a choice, right, in where they want to vote, in how they want to vote, and also the different kinds of alternatives that are out there. Whether this makes for a stronger sense of democratic purpose is not clear, but it certainly means that Canadians are faced with an array of choices that may be broader than Americans, for example. So in the United States, the bipartisan nature of the party system forces, in effect, people to choose. And as we've seen in more recent American political history, tends to polarize people as well in terms of their political preferences. In terms of parties, we see much stronger partisan attachment, or what we call party ID in the political science literature, in the United States as compared, for example, to Canada. So people tend to be much more possessive in their ability to identify with a political party, whereas in Canada there tends to be more of a movement. Flexible partisans is what we tend to label the Canadian electorate. That being said, in terms of a political identity, it depends. There's strong partisan identities. This may feed into the sense that Americans have a stronger sense of political identity wrapped up in a political culture, a sense of belonging to the American way of life or to this thing called the United States than we do in Canada. But that's not necessarily something that correlates with healthy democracy, for example. So in Canada, the fact that you can have competing loyalties, both in the partisan sense, but also identity-wise, doesn't necessarily mean that there's less of a democratic purpose, right, to the way Canadians feel about politics.
I seem to have way more American friends than I do Canadian friends. I don't know why. It's not an intentional thing, but I don't know. I guess I'd say Americans are a little bit more like opinionated. I don't know if that's good or bad. I think politics has a bigger effect on like the like home life of an American. Like it's brought up more often. I'm not saying it isn't in Canada, but I think it's a bigger factor in America, and so people are more quick to form opinions about stuff, whether that's good or bad. I don't know.
Like from my perspective as a Canadian, this is probably pretty biased, but I've always felt like Canadians are kind of more progressive than Americans in certain ways. Like we have more like progressive ideas about society and things, and we kind of lead the change in terms of like I don't know, marriage rights or like things like that. Like politically, we're kind of like ahead of the game in terms of maybe because we're a smaller country and so change can happen like a lot easier. But that's just one of my biases.
Canada is very much an unfinished business, and so to be Canadian is to be part of a journey, right? Part of a process, and that I think that is a much more exciting and interesting kind of a collective project, let's say, than something that is cast in stone.
Someone once compared Americans to Canadians, saying Americans are friendlier, but Canadians are politer. And I thought that actually was really true, because Canadians will not go out of their way to talk to you on the street, but they will say sorry or, you know, make things easier for you in any situation. But Americans just kind of get in your face, and it's nice when they're friendly, but it can be a little abrasive.
Yeah, like when we were in Alabama. Like you notice that the waitstaff, I think that's where I notice it the most. Like your Canadian waitstaff is always like super nice, but they're not going to talk to you. But like if you're in a restaurant in the States, like I don't know, maybe this is just my parents, but like we will frequently find out the entire life story of the waitress or whatever is going on there. And immediately when they sat down, they were like, "So, would you like some fried pickles to start?" And we were like, What? Like, it was like, oh, you guys aren't from around here, are you? No, we're not.
As I would encounter people from like Toronto and outside Toronto, I would hear the long A's, and they're just, because it's North America it's all suburbs, so their suburban culture is very similar to my suburban culture. So there were no like drastic culture shocks. It was just like little differences. Like I would Taylor ham for me is a thing, but people from outside Toronto don't know what Taylor ham is. Just small regional quirks like that. So nothing like massive. I feel weird because like any term, the term American identity kind of suggests that there is this one like monolithic conception of American identity, and I am from the East Coast, and my conception of what it means to be American is probably very different from someone who's from like the heartland of the U.S. So, if anything, college has made me feel less American. Because I've never truly felt American. I've had Canadian citizenship my entire life. I've been out of Canada. Also, my family is Ukrainian, so we speak Ukrainian at home. So I've always felt this kind of like, if there is a monolithic American culture of like hot dogs and barbecues, I've always felt semi-apart from it. If anything, going to university has made me feel less American.
I grew up around a lot of people who were from everywhere, right? Like all these people from the Caribbean, all these people from India, and so we would always have like multicultural days at school, and people would bring in like food and dances and costumes and stuff, and people would always ask me what my background was, and I would say Canadian, and they were like, oh no, but really, where are you from? Just Canada. Like, it doesn't feel like it's a real identity. It's because there's no like obvious cultural associations with Canada. Canada is like such an amalgam of things that it's very difficult to pinpoint what it means to just be Canadian.
Yeah, and I think that people in Canada spend more time connecting with their other
backgrounds and identities.
Because it's not as big of a deal to be Canadian as it is to be American.
So I grew up in New England area, and New England is still, kind of some sense home. We moved here in the fall of 2009. We've had a very, very positive experience with healthcare, with childcare. It's been very, very good for us. As my children, my son's a Canadian, dual citizen. My daughter was born in the U.S., but has lived her whole life in Quebec. I'm starting to think about that, and that makes me feel weirdly guilty. It's a strange thing. I mentioned this once to my wife, and she said, I don't know what you're talking about. Things are good here. It's fine here. It's great here. So I will say, I really like Canada a lot. I really like Quebec a lot. We're becoming permanent residents, but I don't want to become a citizen because I don't want to swear allegiance to the Queen.
I just remember like the first couple weeks of school and people being like, oh my gosh, there are milk in bags. Like, oh, it's so crazy.
Americans are inherently better because we have Chipotle. Well, maybe we're inherently more spoiled because we have Chipotle. But it's good, and Canadians don't have it. And that's the only real difference between Canada and America.